Hi, my name is Drew Davidson from the University of Kansas. I'm going to be presenting joint work with Niels Hansen, also of the University of Kansas, and Lorenzo Carli from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. This work is called Assessing Adaptive Attacks Against Trained JavaScript Classifiers. The one-slide synopsis of this work is that JavaScript classifiers need to account for adaptive adversaries. We show this and make this task easier by parameterizing adversary strength by knowledge of the target website and what defenses are being deployed on that target website. We also develop 3 different threat models that correspond to different adversary strengths and show representative attacks in these models. We also use them to characterize the adversary's various capabilities. In order to put this into context, let's discuss what the role of JavaScript classifiers are, and then we'll describe why adaptive adversaries are effective against them. To show our attacks, we're going to use a very classic setup of a JavaScript injection attack. This is kind of a 3-component attack with an attacker, a target website, and a victim user. The attack begins when the attacker crafts a malicious payload, some type of JavaScript, and injects it into the target website via some kind of vulnerability, perhaps a cross-site scripting attack. At some later point, the user will attempt to access the website, and the website will respond with web content, which will include likely static content, some benign scripts which are supposed to be served, and of course the malicious payload which was injected. All of this data is part of the response to the user. The data will be executed in the context of the browser, which unfortunately includes execution of the attack script, at which point the attack launches. This may include some type of damage such as an exfiltration back to the attacker's domain. A great deal of work has focused on trying to prevent the injection in the first place, but it has been found to be very difficult to prevent the injection. In fact, the injection attack remains the #1 threat on the OWASP top 10 list. An alternative, which has been considered and is the focus of this work, is the use of a classifier deployed on the target site. Any script, before it is served to the user, first passes through classification. If the intention is that benign scripts will pass classification and attack scripts will fail classification. Scripts that fail classification are then disallowed from executing, which will prevent exfiltration and effectively thwart the attack. This is a high-level description of what a classifier is, but our intention is to generally consider the behavior of a large class of classifiers. We formalize the problem of classification as a function f from JavaScript program p to one of 2 labels, either b for benign or m for malicious, the malicious obviously being disallowed. In our work, we focus on classifiers which are trained offline on a subset of benign programs and potentially a subset of malicious examples based on the type of classifier. The reason we use subsets here is because it is much more realistic for how real-world classifiers have to operate. In practice, it is infeasible or impossible to have all of the benign scripts as part of your training set. The reason why is because the set of training scripts or the set of scripts may be dynamic and thereby impossible to gather or just too large. So these sets, the benign and malicious, are fed into a classifier which builds some kind of model, and that model is then used for online classification to tell if a script under test is benign or not. Looking at the classifier in a little bit more detail, let's look at some of the challenges involved. The biggest problem, the biggest challenge in the classification problem is maintaining a low false evasion rate. That is to say, it should be rare for a malicious script to be marked as benign while also maintaining a low false alarm rate. That is to say, it should be rare that a benign script is marked as malicious. Doing this with only a subset of scripts requires a suitable abstraction for how scripts are supposed to be viewed internally by the system. A common solution is to use the abstract syntax tree, a tree-like structure of the script. So the way a classifier often works is the AST is first extracted, and then because the AST is correlated with the program's functionality, so it's a fairly reasonable choice, and then classification is performed on the AST. Of course, this fact that the AST is only correlated with the program's functionality gives an opportunity for adversarial behavior. Indeed, the intuition behind an adaptive adversary is that they might be able to create what's known as a mimicry script in our terminology. That is to say, it looks like a benign script, but it behaves like an attack script. It still fulfills the attack functionality. So it's sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will. More formally, the way an adaptive adversary works is given a classifier and a malicious program, PM, such that PM is classified as malicious, the adversary seeks to create a new program, PM star, that is classified as benign but maintains the malicious functionality. In order to test whether our adaptive adversaries are effective, we consider two main different types of classification techniques. The first is that of a structural classifier, and to make this more concrete, we focus particularly on a defense framework called CSP Autogen. Although CSP Autogen is a large system, it does have to solve the classification problem, and hence we consider it a good representation of structural classifiers. The way structural classifiers work is that they determine whether a script is benign based on whether it is a structural match for something that it's seen as benign during its training phase. As such, CSP Autogen only needs a set of benign scripts and considers anything that is not similar in structure to a benign script to be malicious. The second type of classifier is feature-based. We use as our representative example a system called JAST, which extracts n-gram feature vectors from ASTs during training and uses both a benign and malicious training set, and then separates them using a random forest classifier. The first threat model that we describe in the paper is the non-adaptive adversary, which has no additional knowledge about the target website. Both JAST and CSP Autogen implicitly use the non-adaptive adversary in their evaluation and are quite effective against it. They have nearly a 0% evasion rate, so hardly any malicious scripts are marked as benign. Our next threat model that we articulate in the paper, we call the reconnaissance adversary. The difference between the reconnaissance adversary and the non-adaptive adversary is that the reconnaissance adversary has a reconnaissance phase where they can collect a set of benign scripts. They can then, instead of injecting the attack script, craft their mimicry script out of the benign scripts that they collect and the attack scripts that are their goal to inject. They then inject the mimicry script, which is then ultimately going to be passed to the user, and if the mimicry is successful, it will pass classification and re-enable the attack. We believe that the reconnaissance adversary is easily achieved in practice because the set of benign scripts can simply be collected by visiting the target website. Clearly, it is the case that those scripts will pass classification and serve as positive examples of benign scripts because they run when the adversary just collects and runs scripts on the site before launching the attack. We introduced two different attacks in the reconnaissance adversary threat model, script stitching and subtree editing. The script stitching attack is quite simple and relies on the intuition that the malicious script is comparatively small compared to a benign script. The attack proceeds by simply taking a random benign script, which was collected during reconnaissance, and appending it to the malicious script. The intuition is that the features of the benign script are expected to drown out or kind of overwhelm the details of the malicious script, and thus cause classification, especially classification which is feature vector based, to ignore the malicious perturbation. The second attack that we develop, we call subtree editing, and this is designed to defeat a structural classifier. It works by looking through the set of benign scripts to find one which is close to the AST of the attack script. So if we have an attack script like this, and we have a training set which includes, of course, the benign samples and the malicious scripts that we're interested in injecting, we find a script, and if we can find an area of the tree which is close according to a subtree editing metric that we describe in the paper, we replace that section of the benign script with the malicious one, causing the malicious script to appear structurally, causing the mimicry script to appear structurally similar to the benign script that is effectively hosting it. We now turn to our third threat model, the classifier-aware adversary. This threat model is more powerful strictly than the reconnaissance adversary. It has reconnaissance, but additionally has access to details of the classifier and can use that in its mimicry attack. The classifier-aware adversary is also achievable in practice because perhaps the adversary has some sort of inside information about the target website, but if not, they can simply build a surrogate classifier by feeding their reconnaissance scripts and their attack scripts into a local classifier. This enables an additional attack, which we call gadget composition. Gadget composition really builds upon the idea of script stitching, but is slightly more elegant and slightly higher overhead as well. The idea is that instead of appending a random script to the end of the malicious script, you will take small snippets of scripts and find one that, according to the classifier, which you have access to, moves the mimicry script closer to the idealized feature vector in the learned model. So this appending of little script snippets continues for either until a certain number of maximum iterations is reached, or until additional concatenations of script snippets don't result in any sort of improvement. So I'm going to turn now to evaluation of our three attacks. I'm going to limit our evaluation to just some highlights because we don't have really time for the full thing. The main sort of takeaway is that our attacks did end up being quite effective. Against CSP AutoGen, we expected the subtree editing attack would be most effective, and indeed it was. We found that about 27% of domains could have at least one evasive attack get through the classifier, and there was at least one domain with over 700 attacks that could be generated. We found at least one domain in the attack against JAS to have far more than that, almost over 16,000 examples, and overall, because we felt all of the attacks could potentially work against JAST, we tried them all and got almost 100% evasive attacks. Well, 96% of evasive attacks. 96% of domains had an evasive attack work. Although we believe that our results show that neither type of classifier should be considered safe in practice, we did find that the structural classifier did work a little bit better than JAST. We're also interested in knowing whether the characterization of knowledge as being more power for the adversary was appropriate. So we did a sample with 50 domains and considered 34 attack scripts. We found that the more knowledge the adversary had, it actually did enable more attacks. In fact, there were 45 combinations of scripts and domains where the gadget composition attack succeeded, sort of knowing more about the classifier than the simple script stitching attack, which was a reconnaissance adversary example. We were also interested in knowing, given these extra mimicry scripts, could those actually be used to enhance the classifier? In other words, during training of the classifier, could you generate mimicry scripts and use them to have more robustness against these types of attacks? Unfortunately, we found that not to be the case. Adding mimicry scripts to the training did slightly improve the evasion rate, but at the cost of a massive increase in the false alarm rate all the way up to 12%, which seems to be kind of a deal breaker for a production system. And we feel that this indicates that more sophisticated classification might be necessary rather than just better training data. Indeed, false alarms seem to be a pretty big problem for structural classifiers as well. We did a tenfold cross-validation test with CSP AutoGen and showed that it had an over 10% false alarm rate, which is probably too high for any kind of real production use. So the summary of our evaluation is that adaptive adversaries do increase evasion rate of attacks, and attempts to address it directly seems to incur unacceptably high false alarm rates. We are not the first to consider mimicry attacks against web classifiers. Fast et al. In CCS 2019 created hide no seek, which consists of a single attack, which is similar to our subtree editing attack. It is perhaps a little bit more elaborate. It has a higher evasion rate, but it is significantly higher overhead than the attacks that we describe here. There's also other defense work. Zazzle and Revolver both use ASTs for other types of classification, and we would potentially be interested in seeing if our work applies there. So in conclusion, we believe that adaptive adversaries can subvert assumptions of classifiers and that their knowledge makes them more powerful. We believe that these findings show that a call to arms is necessary for new defenses against AST-based classification as a defense against script injection. And we believe that any further evaluation of those systems should consider the use of our threat model to determine effectiveness. We also believe that there are other attacks under the reconnaissance adversary and classifier-aware threat models, and we look forward to evaluating in those spaces and looking for more attacks. Thank you for your attention. Here's our email addresses. Please feel free to let us know if you have any questions.